I don't need to say that the disaster I outlined in the last episode never happened, though it could have, and according to many who have combed through the details of those dangerous days over the last 60 years, it likely should have. By that I mean there are far more ways that the Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended badly than ways it ended as it did. My tale of disaster is what historians call a counterfactual. And it's the kind of thought experiment that most of them stay far, far away from. It's a kind of guilty pleasure that finds its way into the later hours of graduate gatherings, fueled by beer and youthful intellectual exuberance. But counterfactuals can play a serious role in understanding historical events, no matter how resistant mainstream scholarship might be to poking around their speculative edges. Political scientist Jack Levy put it this way: how can we use what did not happen, but which easily could have happened, to understand what did happen? So, after 60 years, what more can be said about the Cuban Missile Crisis? What does it still have to teach? Well, given the state of geopolitics, the tensions, the weak links, and the breaking points, I think quite a lot. There's great value in looking at exactly what did not happen in those most dangerous days of 1962, but what might have happened, to understand both what did happen and what might very well still happen today, and tomorrow. The planet in general, and the two superpower blocs, were spared the worst the crisis had to offer. Things worked out, the world survived, and that was in no way guaranteed. War games and computer simulations over the decades have consistently seen the October crisis spiral into anarchy and destruction, with only one chain of events offering salvation. Largely because that is the chain of events we have without counterfactuals. Change one or two things, the system collapses. Change three, and sometimes we're back on track. One problem with many versions of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that they often attribute our collective deliverance to the cooler heads in the White House, or to a thoughtful, historically minded Kennedy. Then Secretary of State Dean Rusk always called it a triumph of American and Soviet diplomacy. Given what we know to have actually happened up to a point, these are valid points to be made when trying to understand leadership and crisis. But where was the leadership in the U.S. intelligence establishment? As far back as the spring and summer of 1962, when reports from Cuban refugees about offensive missiles in Cuba were plentiful. That summer, New York Senator Kenneth Keating charged that there were strategic nuclear missiles in Cuba. But the intelligence establishment failed to follow up because he wouldn't reveal his sources. In the beginning of September, Khrushchev swore he wasn't putting missiles into Cuba when that was exactly what he was doing. It would take nearly 6 weeks to find the sites, and by then, they were only days away from becoming operational. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't a success. It was a massive, nearly catastrophic intelligence failure. You want to know something else that could have saved the world from global thermonuclear conflagration, other than the dizzying drama of the 13 days in October? More CIA photos in September. historical analysis very rarely peeks into what might have been done to avoid the whole thing and selects October 16th as the starting point, no matter what came before. I do think that there is a place for counterfactuals, especially in this case. In this anniversary month of what might have been the Third World War, by looking at each point of critical decision or reactions to inexplicable turns in the unfolding timeline, the real magnitude of the events can be made clear. Nearly 6 decades later, every analysis, from scholarly tomes to high school textbooks, if they mention the incident at all in their current withered state, asserts the danger without ever explaining fully that it really would have been the end of the superpowers and the death of hundreds of millions of people. At first, very quickly, and then very painfully slowly. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a wonderful teaching tool because it is a crisis of sufficient brevity and density that it offers counterfactual proposals that have immediate impacts without adding very many more variables to the problem. The way that the magnitude of, say, World War II makes second-guessing the impact of any single decision nearly impossible. But the Cuban Missile Crisis still carries all of the gravity of a World War historical problem, and it's an example of the massive impact that individual decisions can have, whether made wisely or in a vacuum of ignorance. And on both sides, the Cuban Missile Crisis has its fair share of wisdom, ignorance, stubbornness, pride, fear, and folly. It's a wonder they didn't set the world on fire. One mystery of history is that something always comes before. The story of World War II is impossible to tell without the story of World War I, without colonialism, without the histories of alliances that go back to Charlemagne, if you wanted to do an extremely and potentially unnecessary deep dive. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and without explaining the roots of the Soviet Union or the origins of the Cuban state, or the Spanish-American War, for that matter, one essential foundational piece of history for understanding is the invasion of Huron Beach, commonly known in the U.S. as the Bay of Pigs. Fidel Castro's socialist movement finally overthrew the Cuban government on December 31st, 1958, and he proceeded to forge strong ties with the Soviet Union, seeing as he was a revolutionary socialist. This was a major thorn in the foot of the U.S. government. But then, Castro started a program of nationalizing U.S. interests on the island, and that angered U.S. corporations, and then something really had to be done. Those nationalizations included fruit and sugar companies, oil companies, and financial institutions. Several companies that are familiar to our ears today still lay claim to assets in Cuba that were nationalized by Castro. A 2015 Washington Post article named a few. Colgate-Palmolive wants its $14 million back. Coca-Cola claims $27.5. Texaco isn't giving up on its $50 million. Exxon still grumbles about $71.6 million. United Fruit Sugar Company, always on its worst behavior in the Americas, is owed $85 million. You would know that company today as Chiquita, the bananas. And leading the list of claims to confiscated property is the long-defunct Cuban Electric Company at $267.5 million. Through a long chain of mergers and acquisitions, shares of the Cuban Electric Company are now owned by Office Depot. Beginning as a plan under Eisenhower, the CIA organized, armed, and trained a group of similarly angry Cuban refugees who would return to the island as a counter-revolutionary force and overthrow Castro. They were known as Brigade 2506. This was the military wing of the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front. Brigade 2506 landed after some difficulty at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, and were met with heavy resistance from regular and militia troops. The exiled army numbered about 1,500, with 8 B-26 bombers in support. Supporting the Cuban government were 25,000 army, 200,000 militia, and 9,000 police. Fighting didn't quite last 3 days. The air support the brigade had expected from the United States never materialized. This was a huge embarrassment to Kennedy, who had only been in office for 3 months. The assumption had been that he would authorize whatever measures were necessary to support the invasion, like Eisenhower had done in Guatemala. But he didn't. The failure haunted him for the rest of his presidency, and life as it would turn out. And some biographers suggest that it tinted all of his decision-making when it came to Cuba and Castro. Far from a disaster for Fidel himself, the invasion actually strengthened his position. In fact, in August, Che Guevara, Castro's fellow revolutionary and poster boy of the counterculture, sent a note to Kennedy that read, "Thanks for Playa Girón. Before the invasion, the revolution was weak. Now it's stronger than ever." The tactical, strategic, and psychological aftermath of the Bay of Pigs is what concerns us at this point in the story. Seeing the U.S. willingness to invade, Castro wanted to defend the island and the revolution. The invasion had gone a long way to prove to Castro, Cubans, and people throughout Latin America what they had already believed. The U.S. was an imperialist power, always teetering on the edge of interference, whether political, military, or both. Castro wasn't going to fall for it again. He called on his economic and spiritual ally, the Soviet Union, to become a military ally as well. Not wanting to lose its newfound foothold in the Americas, the Soviet Union agreed. This set the stage for weapons to be shipped to Cuba. Surface-to-air batteries, Ilyushin-28 jet bombers, and of course, nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. We are now 1 year and 6 months from the end of the world as we know it. Won't you come along?